In August 1590, English Governor John White finally returned to Roanoke Island after spending 3 years delayed in Europe. He came back expecting to reunite with his daughter, his granddaughter, and over 100 English settlers. Instead, he found their settlement completely abandoned. The houses were dismantled, and the area was heavily overgrown. 2 carvings remained in the settlement's woodwork, the letters CRO etched into a tree, and the word Croatoan scraped into a wooden post at the fort's entrance. But just as important as what White found was what he didn't find. Before he left for England, the colonists had agreed on a secret distress signal. If they were forced to leave under duress, they were to carve a cross over their destination. White searched the trees and the posts, but there was no cross. For centuries, those cryptic carvings and the empty fort fueled the myth of the lost colony. The story mutated into American folklore, leaning heavily on the idea of a supernatural vanishing act or a sudden, traceless massacre. But the colonists didn't vanish into thin air. We just haven't had the forensic tools necessary to track their movements, until now. To figure out where the colonists went, we first have to understand exactly why they were forced to leave the island, and the answer to that comes from dendrochronography, which is the scientific study of tree rings to track historical environmental conditions. Each concentric ring represents a year of growth. Wide rings indicate plenty of rainfall, while tight, narrow rings indicate a lack of moisture. In this tree's cross-section, you can see the biological record of the climate when Roanoke was isolated. The rings corresponding to the late 1580s are incredibly narrow, indicating the most severe regional drought in centuries, lasting precisely from 1587 to 1589. This drought devastated the local corn crops, which poisoned relations with the neighboring Croatoan people. The colonists could no longer rely on the tribes for provisions, as both groups were suddenly competing for the same dwindling food supply. With that data, the departure from Roanoke stops looking like a mystery. The colonists were facing severe food shortages, and leaving the island was a calculated biological necessity to escape starvation. This 1585 watercolor map, Virginia Pars, was drawn by Governor John White. For centuries, it sat in the British Museum archives, detailing the region's geography. In 2012, researchers placed the map on a light table and made a startling discovery. Hidden beneath a small paper patch on the map, located about 50 miles inland, was a concealed symbol depicting a fort. This location wasn't random. When John White left in 1587, the colonists had explicitly told him they planned to relocate 50 miles into the mainland. The hidden symbol gave modern archaeologists a literal map to follow. Following that lead, teams from the First Colony Foundation used ground-penetrating radar and began physical excavations along the Chowan River in Bertie County, North Carolina, specifically at 2 dig areas dubbed Site X and Site Y. Here on the table are the results of those excavations. These are reconstructed Elizabethan-era ceramics, including Surrey, Hampshire borderware and North Devon jars. Crucially, the dig sites lacked 17th century clay tobacco pipes, meaning this debris doesn't belong to later settlements. It is hard, physical evidence of late 16th century English occupation. While research continued along the Chowan River basin, another archaeological team focused their attention on the coastline of Hatteras Island, the historical home of the Croatoan. Embedded deep in the coastal dirt, archaeologists uncovered 2 large piles of 16th century iron flakes. This material, known as hammer scale, is a distinct byproduct of English metallurgy. We have Elizabethan English artifacts sitting 50 miles inland, and 16th century English metallurgy sitting right on the coast. The physical evidence shows that the colony didn't migrate as one massive group. They fractured. Historian James Horn calls this the dispersal theory. Facing a catastrophic drought and limited resources, a group of 120 people sticking together meant certain starvation, so they split up to improve their odds. A small group likely went to the coast at Hatteras Island to wait for John White's return, while the majority pushed inland up the Chowan River. They didn't build a new, thriving English metropolis in the woods. The survivors had to rely on people who already knew how to live there, integrating, intermarrying, and assimilating into friendly indigenous societies, like the Croatoan. Without the discovery of 16th-century European burials, this theory remains supported by compelling material culture rather than definitive forensic remains. Archaeologists still seek European graves containing period-specific items that couldn't have been acquired through simple trade. But the available science paints a clear picture. The Roanoke colonists were never truly lost. When faced with a hostile climate and dwindling supplies, they adapted to the world around them. By stripping away the ghost stories and following the tree rings, the maps, and the soil, we find a community that chose resilience over disappearance. On December 4, 1872, the crew of the British brigantine De Gracia spotted a ship drifting erratically midway between the Azores and Portugal. A boarding party rowed over and climbed the rails to find the Mary Celeste completely deserted. The ship itself was entirely seaworthy, its sails were partially set, and its hull was structurally sound. Below deck, the interior remained perfectly intact. The crew quarters held personal belongings, razors, and unsmoked pipes. The hold was stocked with a 6-month supply of food and water, and the ship's lockbox still contained its cash. There were no signs of a storm, a struggle, or a sinking. 10 people had simply vanished from a safe floating environment, leaving their lives behind in mid-ocean. Captain Benjamin Briggs was a highly respected veteran of the maritime trade, regarded by his peers as a man of exceptional competence and steady nerves. He was a devoutly religious teetotaler who enforced a strict no-alcohol policy for his crew. He prioritized reliability and discipline, ensuring his ship was managed by sober, upright sailors. For this voyage, Briggs had brought his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia along for the crossing. A seasoned mariner, fiercely protective of his family, does not order a panicked evacuation into the open Atlantic without cause. Staying aboard must have seemed even more dangerous than facing the winter ocean in a small boat. During the salvage hearings in Gibraltar, Attorney General Solly Flood ignored the captain's character. He pushed a theory of drunken mutiny, suggesting the crew had murdered the family and fled. Flood pointed to deep gashes in the rail and a stained sword as proof of violence. But chemical tests later revealed the blood was just common rust, and the marks on the wood were consistent with standard maritime wear. In 1884, Arthur Conan Doyle published a fiction that renamed the ship the Marie Celeste. His story reached a global audience, popularizing the idea of a ghost ship and cementing supernatural myths in the public imagination. The public chose the drama of a mystery over the reality of the evidence. As the ghost story took hold, the specific physical anomalies found on the deck were largely ignored by the popular narrative. When the ship was found, its only lifeboat was missing, along with the official register and the captain's vital survival tools, his sextant and chronometer. The ship's hold was packed with 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, a volatile industrial product. Upon inspection, 9 of those barrels were found completely empty. Both the fore and lazarette hatch covers had been removed and laid on the deck, and one of the ship's pumps was carefully disassembled. Mutineers or pirates do not stop to gather high-precision navigation equipment or dismantle specific ventilation pumps. These actions reflect a professional, deliberate response to a perceived emergency. In 2006, Dr. Andrea Sella of University College London conducted a chemistry experiment to test a long-standing theory regarding the leaking alcohol. Leaking alcohol fumes pool in the ship's hold, reaching an ignition point. When ignited, they create a massive pressure wave explosion, violently blowing the hatch cover off the deck. Crucially, this blast burns out instantly, leaving 0 thermal damage or scorch marks. This invisible blast perfectly matches the state of the Mary Celeste. It provides the exact mechanism needed to convince a rational, experienced captain that his ship was about to detonate. From Briggs's perspective, a deafening boom shakes the ship, and a hatch launches into the air. He believes the toxic cargo is catching fire, and the entire hull is a ticking bomb. He gathers his navigational tools and orders his family and crew into the lifeboat. His plan is to wait at a safe distance, tethered to the ship, until the fumes have vented and the danger has passed. The ship never caught fire. Instead, as the weather turned, The tether line connecting the small boat to the heavy brigantine likely snapped. 10 people were cast adrift in a fragile boat, forced to watch helplessly as their perfectly safe, floating refuge caught the wind and sailed away without them. The Mary Celeste sailed for 13 more years after its recovery. Its service ended in 1885, when a later captain deliberately crashed it onto a Haitian reef in a failed insurance fraud scheme. For over a century, the empty deck inspired tales of sea monsters and ghosts, but the evidence suggests a much more mundane and more chilling reality. Captain Briggs made the most protective, rational choice possible based on the terrifying information he had at the time. The tragedy is a reminder of the thin line between survival and disaster. Even a decision made by an expert can lead to catastrophe when faced with an unforgiving environment. In 1846, the pioneers of the Donner Party became trapped by an early winter in the Sierra Nevada. As their supplies vanished, they faced a struggle for survival that has become a defining tragedy of the American West. Yet, for all we think we know, a significant portion of their experience remains undocumented. The party was split between two camps. We have a clear window into the camp at Donner Lake because of a surviving diary kept by Patrick Breen. But at the second site, Alder Creek, where the Donners were stranded, there is a total documentary void. This wasn't for a lack of effort. Tamsin Donner, the matriarch at Alder Creek, was an educated teacher and a professional correspondent. Survivors later recalled her writing every single day, meticulously documenting their daily struggle in a journal she intended to keep for her children. In the study of history, a single piece of paper can be the difference between a tragedy remembered for its human resilience and one that is reduced to a list of horrors. By the end of the winter, Tamsin was among the few survivors strong enough to travel. However, when rescue parties arrived, she refused to leave. Her husband, George, was dying from a severe infection, and she chose to remain with him until the end. When the final relief party reached the camp in April 1847, they found a grim scene. Only one man, Louis Kiesenberg, remained alive at the Donner family camp, surrounded by the remains of those who had perished. Kiesenberg eventually confessed to consuming Tamsin's remains to stay alive, but as this account notes, her body was never recovered, and neither was the daily diary she had spent months writing. The disappearance of that journal erased the primary humanizing record of Alder Creek. Without Tamsin's words, the story of the camp was largely handed over to rumors and the sensational reports of the time. Victorian media focused almost exclusively on the details of cannibalism. By emphasizing the shock of the survival tactics, the newspapers effectively stripped the victims of their names and their histories. In 2004, archaeologists returned to the Alder Creek meadow. Their goal was to use modern forensic methods to find any physical evidence that could offer a more nuanced look at life inside the camp. They knew they wouldn't find Tamsin's paper diary. In the damp, freezing soil of the Sierras, organic materials like paper and leather rot away in a matter of years. When the written record is lost, historians turn to cognitive archaeology, the study of physical artifacts to reconstruct the habits, thoughts, and priorities of the people who used them. Near a buried hearth feature, the team discovered several small, dark fragments. As you can see here against the centimeter scale, these aren't just rocks, they are pieces of writing slate. To understand their significance, we have to look at the intact version. In the 1840s, these slates were common household tools, used for everything from classroom lessons to household accounting. This diagram compares the two writing surfaces available to the Donners. Paper is easily ruined by moisture, while slate is waterproof and infinitely reusable. These slates served multiple purposes during the winter, tracking dwindling supplies and debts, or providing school lessons to distract the children. The discovery of the slate suggests that the routines of education and organization persisted even in the depths of the winter. It points to an ongoing effort to maintain a structured, civilized environment within the camp, long after their traditional supplies had run out. Tamsin Donner's exact words remain lost to the mountain. That silence has shaped the legacy of the Donner Party for over a century. For years, writers and historians have attempted to reconstruct her voice, trying to reclaim her identity from the grim accounts associated with her final days. These shattered fragments of stone are the only physical evidence we have of that effort. They are the closest proxy to the journal she kept so diligently. Ultimately, these artifacts shift our perspective. They allow us to remember the people at Alder Creek as parents, teachers, and record keepers, resilient humans who reached for a slate and a pencil to try and write their way through the dark. In early 2024, a sonar image captured on the floor of the Pacific Ocean made headlines across the globe. A deep-sea exploration team argued the object in the scan matched the specific dimensions and silhouette of Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Electra. 11 months later, the team issued a correction. After sending a submersible down to investigate, they discovered the target was a natural rock formation. This pattern of a viral discovery followed by a quiet correction has repeated for decades. In 2017, a major documentary centered its investigation on a photograph claiming to show Earhart and her navigator in Japanese custody on the Marshall Islands. Within days of the broadcast, a military history blogger found the exact same photograph. It had been published in a Japanese travelogue in October 1935, nearly 2 years before Earhart's plane ever took off on its final journey. The public's interest in finding a singular, cinematic resolution can often overshadow the verifiable records that already exist. When we look past the sensational headlines and examine the physical data, a much clearer reality begins to take shape. On July 2, 1937, Earhart and Noonan prepared to depart Lae, New Guinea, for an 18-hour flight to Howland Island. They had been flying for weeks, and cables from Lae noted that the crew was already exhausted before the hardest leg began. The mechanical failures began during takeoff. As the silver Electra accelerated down the runway, the wire receiving antenna on the aircraft's belly snapped off. For the rest of the flight, Earhart could transmit, but her ability to hear incoming signals was severely compromised. This damage was especially dangerous because neither pilot was proficient enough in Morse code to navigate by it. They relied entirely on voice communications over vintage radio transmitters, which were susceptible to distortion and atmospheric noise. Furthermore, Earhart struggled to master her radio direction-finding equipment. During a test flight the day before departure, she failed to lock onto a local signal. She chose to depart anyway, assuming she could troubleshoot the equipment in the air. This wasn't a supernatural disappearance. It was the result of an accident chain, a compounding series of fatigue, broken radio equipment, and procedural errors that crippled the flight before it reached the open ocean. As the plane approached its destination, the Coast Guard cutter Itasca waited off the coast of Howland Island. The ship's radio operators heard Earhart's transmissions becoming increasingly frantic. Over her final hour on the air, her voice rose in pitch as she repeatedly stated she was out of fuel and unable to locate the island. Her desperate tone indicates she knew she was lost. This forms the basis of the crash and sink theory, the idea that Earhart and Noonan were forced to ditch at sea and perished immediately. However, there is a second scenario backed by decades of fieldwork. It is known as the Nikumaroro hypothesis. Navigational research suggests Earhart flew along a line of position and landed safely on the coral reef of Nikumaroro Atoll. Dozens of radio distress signals were detected from this location, and directional bearings from naval stations crossed directly over the island. While sinking into the ocean is the simplest narrative, the Nikumaroro hypothesis is supported by decades of documented physical records recovered from the atoll itself. Just months after the flight disappeared, a British colonial officer visited Nikumaroro. Despite the island being officially uninhabited for 40 years, he reported finding an overnight campsite and signs of recent habitation near the lagoon. Decades later, archaeological teams in that same area uncovered parts of a 1930s-era woman's shoe matching the style Earhart wore. They also recovered the remains of a wooden box. The serial numbers indicated it held a naval sextant, the precise type of backup navigational tool Fred Noonan was known to carry. The most striking data emerged from a government archive in 1997. Researchers uncovered a 1940 government file documenting the discovery of human bones on the island. While the bones themselves were later lost, the recorded measurements were recently analyzed by forensic anthropologists who concluded they matched the height and stature of Amelia Earhart. No single artifact proves the theory on its own, But when these pieces are viewed together, they form a plausible reality of a pilot surviving a crash only to succumb as a castaway. We will likely never find a perfectly intact airplane resting on the seafloor. The ocean is too vast and the reef environment too destructive to yield such a simple answer. Historical investigation rarely relies on a single smoking gun. Instead, it is a preponderance of evidence, the slow accumulation of radio logs, colonial reports, and recovered artifacts that causes researchers to conclude a hypothesis is correct. Accepting this evidence-based reality strips away the romantic mystery. What remains is a deeply humanizing story of a pioneer who pushed herself to the absolute limit, ultimately facing the unforgiving realities of the environment she sought to conquer. To survive an early winter in the Canadian Arctic, you have to fight against -30-degree temperatures, blinding snow, and absolute isolation. In November 1930, a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle trekked through that snow toward the shores of Lake Anjikuni. He had visited the area before and expected to find a bustling Inuit encampment. Instead, when he called out, the only response was the wind. The settlement was completely silent. Walking among the tents, LaBelle found a pot of caribou stew rotting over the ashes of a long-dead fire. He saw sealskin parkas resting mid-repair, bone needles still sticking through the fabric. Strangest of all, rifles stood propped against the tent poles, tools no one in this extreme environment would willingly leave behind. The situation grew darker on the perimeter of the camp. LaBelle found a grave with its heavy protective stones scattered and the earth exposed. Nearby, an entire team of sled dogs lay tethered to a tree, frozen solid after starving to death at their posts. 30 residents had evaporated into thin air. There were no tracks leading away, no signs of a struggle, and no bodies, except for the dogs. LaBelle reported his findings to the authorities, but the story that reached the broader public came from a journalist named Emmett E. Kelleher. In January 1931, Kelleher published a syndicated newspaper feature detailing the event. To ensure the story sold across North America, he inflated the number of missing residents to 25 people. The local oddity might have faded into obscurity if not for an American radio broadcaster named Frank Edwards. In 1959, Edwards published Stranger Than Science, a wildly popular collection of anomalies that repackaged the Lake Anjikuni story for a global audience. Edwards took immense creative liberties with his retelling. He wrote that the population was actually over 1,000 strong. He claimed the graves had been meticulously excavated and emptied. He even added reports of glowing blue UFOs pulsing in the Arctic sky in the days leading up to the disappearance. Over the next 2 decades, the Anjikuni vanishing became a cornerstone of Cold War paranormal literature. Late-night radio hosts, UFO documentaries, and conspiracy theorists passed the narrative back and forth, continually adding details like extraterrestrial abductions and missing internal organs. The alien abduction of Lake Anjikuni became one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in North America. But the actual event taking place in that exact region during those exact decades was entirely terrestrial, heavily documented, and far worse. Back in 1931, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police read Kelleher's original newspaper article and launched an immediate investigation. After interviewing LaBelle and checking local patrol records, the RCMP filed an unambiguous conclusion. The story of a vanished village had no foundation. The Inuit families who utilized the Anjikuni area, specifically the Paddlermute and Ahiarmute bands, did not build permanent year-round settlements. Their entire survival strategy relied on moving dynamically with the massive caribou herds that migrated through the tundra. When these groups moved to follow the herds, they regularly left heavier gear behind. Cooking pots, extra clothing, and backup weapons were cached at established campsites, precisely because the families intended to return the following season. Even the scattered gravestones were simply the result of natural erosion over time. LaBelle had not stumbled upon an abducted village. As a relatively inexperienced trapper in that specific region, he had simply walked into a standard, off-season autumn camp and completely misread the environment. What looked like an eerie, supernatural abandonment to a cultural outsider was actually a highly effective, deeply ingrained indigenous survival adaptation. But while readers across the globe were looking up at the sky for flying saucers, entire communities in the Kivalliq region were actually vanishing. By the 1940s and 50s, the inland Ahiarmut people were still relying on the country around Lake Anjikuni to survive, maintaining the seasonal rhythms their ancestors had practiced for thousands of years. However, European expansion and industrial activity in the surrounding territories disrupted those rhythms. The caribou herd suffered a catastrophic population collapse, plunging the inland Inuit into widespread famine, which was soon followed by severe outbreaks of tuberculosis. The Canadian government's response was not to provide medical care or famine relief. Instead, between 1949 and 1959, federal authorities forcibly relocated the Ahiarmut, uprooting them from their ancestral lands and moving them to remote coastal areas completely devoid of the resources they knew how to hunt. This line chart tracks the estimated Ahiarmut population throughout the early 20th century. You can see a steady decline leading up to the 1940s, followed by a plunging drop from several hundred people down to fewer than 50 individuals. By highlighting the specific years of the government relocations, the correlation becomes painfully clear. The steepest losses of human life align perfectly with these state-mandated removals, as families died of exposure and starvation in their new, barren environments. This population did not disappear overnight in a flash of blue light. Their absence was the result of a slow, agonizing, state-orchestrated cultural erasure. Through the 1960s and 70s, paranormal authors and publishing houses raked in massive profits by printing paperbacks detailing the mysterious alien abduction of the Anjikuni villagers. During those exact same decades, the actual surviving victims of the Ahiarmut relocations were still alive, fighting for basic survival, and completely ignored by the public consuming those paperbacks. It took decades of advocacy for the truth to be officially recognized. Finally, in 2019, the Canadian government issued a formal apology and financial compensation to the survivors and descendants of the forced relocations. The persistence of the UFO myth actively functioned as a smokescreen. It allowed a settler society to obsess over an entertaining, manufactured mystery instead of looking directly at the destructive consequences of their own federal policies. When given the choice between an extraterrestrial thriller and a grounded history of bureaucratic neglect, the public chose the thriller. A supernatural mystery is always going to be easier to digest than confronting a very real historical atrocity. On December 5, 1945, 5 United States Navy bombers flew into a storm off the coast of Florida and vanished. Shortly after, a massive flying boat sent to rescue them disappeared as well. By the next morning, 6 aircraft and 27 men were gone without a trace. Take a look at this map, which outlines a specific stretch of the Atlantic Ocean, bounded by Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. The loss of those planes, known as Flight 19, served as the geographical anchor for what would become a global cultural legend. The fascination with that region was largely manufactured decades after the event. Pulp magazine writers like Vincent Gaddis and Charles Berlitz realized they could sell millions of books by weaving stories of magnetic anomalies and time portals into the actual flight records. To make these stories stick, they needed a hook. Berlitz famously wrote that the flight leader's final radio transmission warned, "Don't come after me. They look like they are from outer space." In reality, that line never appeared in the logs. It was a total fabrication designed to suggest otherworldly interference. These narratives prioritized profitable intrigue over the flight records, replacing a documented military failure with a durable cultural phenomenon. To understand the actual fate of the squadron, we have to look past the paperbacks and analyze these analog tools and maps. This is the raw evidence the military investigation actually used to reconstruct the final hours. The flight was led by Lieutenant Charles Taylor, taking a group of trainees on navigation problem number 1. This was a routine 3-hour practice bombing run departing from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Here we see the communication setup operators used to monitor skies in 1945. It was through stations like this the military caught their first sign of trouble. intercepted radio transmissions of Taylor stating he was lost, disoriented, and unsure of his location. These frantic transmissions weren't a response to supernatural forces, but the beginning of a catastrophic breakdown in basic aerial navigation. Taylor mistakenly believed he was flying over the Florida Keys instead of the Bahamas. He calculated the Florida peninsula lay right and ordered a northeast turn. But from the Bahamas, that bearing pointed directly into the vast Atlantic Ocean. A simple misidentification of an island chain locked all 5 planes onto the exact wrong bearing, pushing them further away from safety with every drop of fuel burned. By early evening, conditions were stacked against them. Darkness fell, the air was turbulent, and the sea below churned with massive waves from 40-mile-per-hour winds. At 6:20 p.m., Taylor's final transmission broke through the static. Their fuel was exhausted. He ordered the squadron to ditch their heavy bombers into the pitch-black water, a maneuver with a survival probability near zero in such rough seas. The legend expanded when the Navy scrambled a PBM-5 Mariner seaplane to search the area. Within hours, it too vanished with all 13 crew members. While theorists suggest a vortex, the physical evidence points to a mundane disaster. Mariner aircraft were notorious for leaking gas fumes into the cabin, and that same night, a passing merchant ship reported seeing a massive mid-air fireball. The enduring popularity of paranormal theories often depends on setting aside these brutal physical realities, mechanical failure, and fatal weather conditions. This declassified document is part of the Navy's initial 500-page investigation report. Published a few months after the tragedy, it correctly identified Taylor's disorientation and the mariner's mechanical failure as the definitive causes. But Lieutenant Taylor's mother refused to accept the findings. She aggressively fought the report, arguing that it was unfair to place the blame for the deaths of 14 men squarely on her son's shoulders, when no physical wreckage had been recovered to prove it. In 1947, the Navy relented. To spare the grieving family any further pain, a corrections review board amended the official cause of the disappearance to causes unknown. That single act of administrative empathy inadvertently created a massive information vacuum. By officially declaring the cause a mystery, the military handed conspiracy theorists the cover they needed to invent stories about aliens and Atlantis to fill the void. Even today, dedicated researchers continue to search for physical wreckage in places like the Florida Everglades, hoping to unearth a decayed airframe and finally close the case with undeniable proof. The legend persists because the intrigue of the supernatural often feels more compelling than the repetitive tragedy of human error. Flight 19 leaves behind the solemn memory of 27 men who lost their lives to human error, mechanical vulnerability, and an unforgiving ocean. For nearly 40 years, motorists on West Virginia's Route 16 passed a massive, weather-beaten billboard. It featured the grainy portraits of 5 dark-haired children, alongside a question that defined a local legend. What was their fate? Kidnapped? Murdered? Or are they still alive? The billboard was the work of George and Jenny Sodder, Italian immigrants who lived in the small town of Fayetteville. On Christmas Eve 1945, they were asleep in their home along with 9 of their 10 children. Around 1 a.m., a fire erupted downstairs. George, Jenny, and 4 of their children managed to escape into the freezing night, but 5 of the siblings remained trapped in the upstairs attic bedrooms. George's rescue attempts failed at every turn. He found the ladder missing from its usual spot against the house. He ran to his 2 coal trucks, intending to use them as a platform to reach the attic windows, but both engines suddenly refused to start. He was left in the yard, listening to the screams of his children while the house was consumed. When the sun rose and the volunteer fire department cooled the debris, the story took an impossible turn. A search of the ashes revealed remnants of household appliances, but no bodies. Not a single recognizable human bone was recovered from the ruins. This lack of physical remains convinced George and Jenny that their children never died in the blaze. They spent the rest of their lives believing the fire was a distraction for an abduction. The family eventually built a case for a targeted abduction. theorizing that the Sicilian mafia had taken the children as retaliation. George was a vocal critic of Benito Mussolini, often engaging in fierce arguments within Fayetteville's Italian immigrant community. Only months before the fire, an insurance salesman had threatened George, warning that his house would burn and his children would be destroyed because of his dirty remarks about the dictator. Physical evidence also suggested deliberate sabotage. A repairman later told the grieving family that their phone lines appeared to have been physically cut rather than burned through to prevent calling for help. Jenny recalled hearing a heavy thud on the roof, followed by a rolling sound just before the fire started. George believed this was an incendiary bomb, likely a military-grade device used to spark the blaze from the roof down. Suspicion also fell on the local fire chief, F.J. Morris. He admitted to secretly burying a piece of what he called a heart in a dynamite box at the scene. When the family excavated the box, they took the contents to a funeral director, who identified the tissue as raw beef liver. The Sodders pleaded with the FBI to intervene, citing the cut wires and the fire chief's strange behavior. However, J. Edgar Hoover's office declined, stating the case was a local matter outside their jurisdiction. To the public, the disparate clues of the missing ladder, stalled trucks, and lack of bones formed a cohesive narrative of a coordinated international kidnapping. That narrative is compelling, but looking at the timeline through a forensic lens provides a much more mundane explanation for the anomalies. This diagram illustrates the physical reality of the fire. The structure was heated by coal, and when the floors collapsed, the house fell into the basement's fuel reserves. This created an active underground furnace that retained extreme heat for several hours. This chart compares that prolonged thermal curve against cremation data. While modern crematoriums use higher heat for shorter durations, a long-burning coal fire can easily reduce the softer, developing bones of children to unidentifiable ash or chalky fragments. The emergency response was also severely limited. The 1945 volunteer department was under-resourced, and the chief struggled to find someone to drive the fire truck. They didn't arrive until 7 hours after the fire started. When they finally began their search, the volunteers were poorly equipped. They spent only 2 hours sifting through the debris without any forensic training whatsoever. They were looking for recognizable skeletons, likely overlooking pulverized fragments in the ash. Any remaining microscopic evidence was then lost when George Sodder bulldozed 5 feet of dirt over the site just days after the fire. His attempt to create a memorial garden inadvertently destroyed the crime scene before state investigators could arrive. The man who clipped the phone line turned out to be a local thief after a block and tackle. He likely mistook the communication cable for a power line. As for the trucks, mechanics suggest George likely flooded the engines in the freezing night air. Most telling is the early testimony of the oldest son, John, who was in the home. He admitted to state police that he shook his siblings to wake them, but the heavy smoke forced him to flee before leading them out. Stripped of the myth, the evidence reveals a heartbreaking cascade of accidents, human panic, and a bungled emergency response. The fire chief likely planted the beef liver out of gross incompetence, hoping any discovery of remains would satisfy the grieving parents and end the investigation. For George and Jenny, however, accepting the forensic reality meant accepting the unbearable, that they had stood in the yard and watched their children perish in an accident. Survivor's guilt shaped the family's reality. John Sodder's subsequent refusal to talk about the fire suggests a deep trauma, while the parents built a narrative where the children were still alive to avoid the finality of their loss. This hope dictated their lives. Jenny wore black exclusively until her death in 1989, and George spent his final years chasing ghosts across the country, building fences around his grief. The Sodder children mystery remains a profound monument to human psychology. It demonstrates that when faced with an unbearable truth, the mind can build a lifelong labyrinth of hope to avoid the reality of the ashes. In American slang, if someone disappears suddenly and completely, leaving absolutely no trace behind, they are said to have pulled a Judge Crater. The phrase originates from a very real person, New York Supreme Court Justice Joseph Force Crater. In the summer of 1930, Crater held a seat of immense power. He was a magistrate operating within the formidable halls of the state's highest courts. On a hot August evening that year, he finished dinner at a Manhattan restaurant, waved goodbye to his friends, and stepped into a waiting taxi. From that moment forward, he ceased to exist in the public eye. A prominent, easily recognizable official evaporated from a crowded city street. The immediate aftermath brought the city to a standstill. Police and the media descended on the streets, triggering one of the most intense and desperate manhunts in New York's history. The void left by a Supreme Court justice suggested that the highest levels of the legal system were not as untouchable as the public assumed. A pillar of the city's power had simply dissolved. With the street search yielding nothing, investigators shifted their focus to the records Crater left behind. Inside his chambers, they found a quiet, methodical void. His personal files and sensitive records had been completely cleared out before he hailed that taxi. This chart tracks Crater's estimated bank balances leading up to his disappearance. Following a period of stability, the data reveals a sudden plummet, driven by massive, unexplained cash withdrawals right before August 1930. These parallel trails of missing paper and missing money pointed away from a random accident or a street mugging. These were the actions of someone preparing for a departure. The lack of a trail became the trail itself, a series of deliberate erasures, suggesting that Crater was not a victim of chance, but a participant in his own vanishing. To understand who might benefit from his absence, detectives looked at the environment Crater operated in. New York in the 1930s was governed by a political machine where loyalty was the primary currency. Crater's desk sat at an intersection of power and debt. Rumors of high-stakes blackmail surfaced, linked to a political system that demanded absolute silence from its members. Beyond politics, the city's criminal underworld heavily influenced the courts. The mob had every reason to permanently remove a judge who had become a liability to their operations. This official circular authorized a $5,000 reward, a small fortune during the Great Depression, to break the silence. Law enforcement blanketed the country with these descriptions, listing his height, weight, and even dental work, yet the campaign yielded no credible leads. The inability of the state to find a sitting judge, even with the full weight of the police and a massive reward, suggested that a different, more effective authority was operating in the shadows of the city. As the months turned into years, and the years into decades, the active investigations slowly ground to a halt. The leads dried up, and the physical trail went completely cold. A cold case with no body has a distinct effect on the public consciousness. Without a grave to anchor the facts, the event mutates from a criminal file into an urban legend. Long after the detectives stopped knocking on doors, whispers continued to echo through the city. The most enduring rumor involved a concrete tomb. Decades later, a persistent myth took hold that Crater's body had been secretly buried beneath the concrete foundation of a rising New York skyscraper. But despite the countless theories and confessions that followed, no solid, verifiable evidence has ever been produced to confirm his final resting place. Unable to solve the crime, society found a different way to cope with the mystery. They integrated his disappearance into their everyday language. Because the authorities could never trap Judge Crater in a physical grave, the public trapped him in their lexicon instead. He became the eternal cultural symbol for stepping out onto a city street and vanishing without a trace. For decades, Jimmy Hoffa controlled the nation's supply chains as the fiercely powerful leader of the Teamsters Union. In the summer of 1975, he was seen standing outside a suburban Detroit restaurant, waiting for a meeting that never happened. He had traveled there to meet known mob figures. They never arrived, and Hoffa never returned home. Police eventually found his car sitting empty and unlocked in the restaurant's parking lot, with no signs of a struggle. To erase such a high-profile public figure in broad daylight without leaving a single trace suggested a level of coordination that only an entrenched, organized syndicate could provide. The FBI responded by launching an investigation that would eventually span several decades. Investigators spent years chasing leads and excavating hidden sites across the country, searching for any sign of his remains. Despite these massive efforts and the passage of time, they never recovered a body. This lack of physical evidence created an information vacuum. When the facts stalled, the public imagination took over. As the official inquiry went cold, wild rumors spread across the country to explain his disappearance. One persistent theory claimed Hoffa was buried beneath the concrete of a famous football stadium. This resonated because of Hoffa's reach. His union controlled the labor for the very infrastructure projects that were physically reshaping the American landscape. Another theory suggested his body had been sealed inside a steel industrial drum. This idea tied the disposal directly to the union's connections with heavy industry and waste management. These rumors mirrored the industrial sectors Hoffa had dominated throughout his life. A third prominent rumor proposed that Hoffa wasn't killed at all, but was instead smuggled safely out of the country. This theory relied on his deep connections with untouchable figures, who had the resources to execute an international evasion. The public shifted between these outcomes, from violent disposal to a clean escape, showing a broad spectrum of suspicion. Regardless of the method, each legend assumes an organized network capable of managing a total disappearance. The elaborate nature of these theories shows that the public viewed Hoffa and his associates as a shadow system operating entirely outside the reach of the law. Over time, the mystery evolved. A gritty true crime story transformed into a piece of modern folklore. These legends became symbols of the dangerous ties between absolute power and corruption. Hoffa built a massive empire through the ruthless, unaccountable means that led to his vanishing. Today, he is a permanent fixture in American popular culture, his name synonymous with the unsolved. Even today, whenever a massive new construction project unearths a mysterious burial site, it triggers an immediate, nationwide cultural reflex. Americans still ask if they have finally found Jimmy Hoffa, a question that suggests the myth of his influence has outlived the man himself.